What if I told you that the most terrifying number in Western civilization, like 666, the literal number of the beast?
Right, the one from all the horror movies.
Exactly. The concept that has spawned doomsday cults and all this modern political panic.
Yeah.
What if I told you that it's actually just a 2,000-year-old typo?
Yeah, it's pretty staggering when you really look into it.
Because today, we are prying open a massive historical zipped file. And if you're listening to this right now, I really want you to ask yourself, like, have you ever noticed how humans absolutely love throwing stones from inside glass houses?
Oh, constantly. Especially when it comes to, these colossal cultural systems.
Right. Like, we love pointing fingers. We hyper-fixate on the supposed cracks in someone else's belief system, all while standing completely oblivious to the massive structural impossibilities holding up the one we inherited.
It's basically the ultimate blind spot in human psychology. I mean, we are remarkably skilled at identifying historical and logical fallacies in our neighbor's worldview. We can spot their mythology from a mile away.
Yeah, but our own is somehow perfect.
Exactly. We will ferociously defend the exact same mythological architecture, the same absurdities in the system we just happen to be born into.
And breaking down that blind spot, that is the entire mission of today's deep dive. We have an incredibly unique set of sources in front of us today. What we're exploring is a collection of deeply candid, wonderfully cynical voice memos.
Raw audio notes, basically.
Yeah, from a user who is actively deconstructing the religious programming they grew up with. But here is the kicker. Paired with those raw human thoughts, we have a rigorous, heavily cited historical and scientific fact check.
Right, generated by an AI analyzing those exact voice memos.
It is so cool. It is essentially like watching someone trust their gut instinct that the matrix is glitching and then having a supercomputer spit out the exact lines of corrupted code to prove that they are right.
It creates this fascinating dialogue, really, between human intuition and raw data, because the user is asking the massive, uncomfortable questions about faith and geopolitics, and the AI is just, well, it's supplying the secular historical blueprints that validate those questions, completely bypassing theology.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I want to set some firm ground rules with you, the listener. Let me be incredibly explicit here. This deep dive is strictly impartial. We are not taking sides.
Right, no sides.
We are not endorsing any specific political worldview, and we are absolutely not issuing any kind of moral condemnation against any religious group. That's just not our job. Our job today is to put on what the source material calls our glasses of cynicism.
I love that phrase.
Right. We are going to look at these ancient scriptures exactly as the user's voice memos describe them, which is as frozen cultural artifacts from ancient people trying to regulate their primitive societies. We are strictly looking at archaeology, history, and translation data.
We are stepping entirely outside the theological bubble for this. We aren't treating these texts as, infallible cosmic mandates that just dropped out of the sky. We're treating them as human history.
Right.
And when you analyze them purely as sociological tools engineered by human beings, it exposes these undeniable, sweeping patterns of projection, massive linguistic mistranslations, and brutal geopolitical control.
Okay, so let's test that framework right out of the gate. If we strip away the divine authority, if we treat these texts not as flawless law, but as the ultimate messy historical book club, what happens to the modern arguments we see on the nightly news?
Well, the narrative completely shifts.
Because the user brings up this massive cognitive dissonance regarding how Islam is portrayed in modern Western media versus the actual recorded history of global conquest. I mean, the script we are all handed today paints Islam purely as this relentless, terrifying engine for subjugation, forced conversion, and violent global takeover.
Yeah.
That's the caricature we see on our screens.
It is arguably the most dominant cultural narrative functioning in the West today. The media just frames it as an inherently aggressive operating system designed exclusively for territorial dominance.
But the user recognized a glaring logical trap in that narrative, and it honestly completely stopped me in my tracks. They laid out what they call the religion of colonization argument. Let's think about this, like corporate software.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. So if you are a ruthless monopoly, let's say you're the British Empire or the Spanish or the French, and your sole objective is to sail around the globe, extract all the resources from your competitors, and subjugate the local populations. You would logically buy the software that is best designed to justify that extraction. Right?
Of course. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, you use whatever works best.
So if Islam was supposedly this ultimate machine for forced global takeover, the European empires would have adopted it as their core operating system.
Yes, and empires are machines of efficiency. They adopt whatever administrative frameworks best facilitate their goals. And the AI's historical fact check on the user's logic here is deeply nuanced, but it entirely validates the core premise.
It does.
It really does. The logic holds up when you look at the last 500 years of modern history. If the goal was unadulterated global subjugation, the empires that actually succeeded in colonizing the planet should have aligned with the system supposedly built for that purpose, but they didn't.
Right.
Western Christianity was the primary ideological vehicle for the last half millennium of global colonization.
Wait, I'm trying to square that circle, though. Because if I read the teachings of a first-century itinerant preacher like Jesus, it doesn't exactly scream, build a global naval armada, invent chattel slavery, and extract the world's wealth.
Right, it really doesn't.
So how did they justify using that specific software for colonization?
This brings us to what the AI outlines as the Roman disguise. European colonization did not use the decentralized teachings of an ancient Galilean carpenter. They utilized a heavily modified, empire-approved version of Christianity.
The zipped file version.
Exactly. They deployed the concept of a civilizing mission, and this allowed them to justify industrialized capitalism, mercantilism, and the horrors of chattel slavery under the guise of paternalistic salvation.
So they claim to be saving the souls of indigenous populations while actively stripping their land of wealth.
Precisely. Now, to be totally objective, the AI makes it clear that Islamic empires weren't exactly peaceful utopias handing out flowers.
Right. They conquered territory, too.
Absolutely. The Umayyad Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, these were massive expansionist global superpowers, but they operated on a very different administrative software. Their expansion was heavily facilitated through vast interconnected trade networks.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that is precisely how Islam spread to places like Indonesia, which currently holds the world's largest Muslim population, without a massive, centralized military invasion. Furthermore, legally, they often utilized a framework where non-Muslim populations paid a specific tax, the jizya.
Okay.
And they paid that in exchange for state protection and exemption from military service.
So if you're a merchant living under Ottoman rule, we're not necessarily forced to convert at sword point. You just pay a different tax rate and keep doing business.
Historically speaking, yes. It was not a system of absolute systematic cultural replacement or forced mass conversion in the way European colonialism operated across the Americas, where indigenous cultures were actively eradicated.
Man, if you're listening to this and feeling your brain kind of twist, think about what this means for the media you consume today. The takeaway the user arrives at is that this intense media-driven anxiety directed at Islam functions as the ultimate whataboutism shield.
It's brilliant redirection.
It is. By forcing populations to look across the geopolitical fence and terrorize themselves with a constructed caricature of another culture, it distracts them. It keeps you from noticing the automated empire of control running effortlessly in your own backyard.
It prevents you from asking the most dangerous question, which is, wait a second, whose software am I currently running?
Exactly. And that psychological projection, throwing the stone from the glass house, it doesn't just happen with geopolitics. It happens directly with the texts themselves. I really want to look at the infamous 72 Virgins media myth.
Oh, this is a massive one.
Yeah, because this is where the user really goes off on how critics invent myths about one text while being completely blind to the brutal realities sitting on their own nightstand.
This is perhaps the most glaring example of textual projection we have in the data. The user pointed out that the frequent critique that Islam inherently promises 72 virgins in heaven to martyrs as a motivation for violence is a massive media-driven fallacy.
And what did the AI say?
The AI fact-checked this claim, and the results were unequivocal. The user is entirely correct.
I mean, we see this in movies, we hear it in political speeches, it's constantly used as a punchline. But the number 72 is literally nowhere in the Quran, is it?
It is completely absent from the Quran. The text mentions companions in paradise, often referred to as hur, but it deliberately never specifies a count, and the descriptions are highly poetic. The specific number 72 originates from a completely separate supplementary text called a hadith.
Which is like a collection of sayings.
Right. Exactly, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Specifically, this claim traces back to a single narration in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi.
Let me stop you there, because not all texts are created equal. Even within their own tradition. It's not like that specific hadith is universally accepted as a flawless guarantee, right?
Far from it. The AI highlights that Islamic scholars have spent centuries heavily debating the authenticity, the isnad, or the chain of transmission of this specific narration.
So they don't even agree on it.
Right. Many classical scholars classify it as a weak narration known as da'af. It is not considered legally or theologically binding by a vast portion of the scholarly community.
Wow.
And the AI notes that this already weak text has been severely twisted and magnified by literalist, hypersexualized Western interpretations. Modern Western critics project their own cultural anxieties onto it.
And here is the glass house shattering into a million pieces. People in the West will point at this historically weak, highly debated supplementary text and scream, look how weird and violent and backwards that is.
All while ignoring their own text.
Exactly. All while completely ignoring the incredibly explicit, hard-coded violence in the Old Testament and the Torah.
The moral double standard is statistically staggering. Critics will surgically isolate these supposed anomalies in Islamic scripture to build a narrative of inherent violence, but they conveniently bypass the explicit commands in their own foundational texts.
Like, what did the AI point out?
The AI highlights 1 Samuel 15.3 as a primary example. In this passage, the biblical God explicitly commands King Saul to engage in total warfare and the complete, unsparing annihilation of the Amalekite people.
Unsparing annihilation.
The text explicitly mandates the slaughter of men, women, children, infants, and even the livestock.
Is total automated genocide, no mercy, no prisoners, wipe them off the map. And yet, modern believers will read that on a Sunday morning and do these incredible mental gymnastics.
Oh, the rationalizations are endless.
They'll say, well, you have to understand the historical context, or it's a metaphor for fighting our internal sins, or God's justice is a mystery we can't understand. They will stretch and bend to sanitize their own text, but they refuse to extend that exact same grace to anyone else's text.
And the irony is that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all Abrahamic religions. They share deeply intertwined historical roots, they share overlapping legalistic frameworks, and they all emerge from the exact same ancient Near Eastern cultural context.
They're essentially operating on different versions of the same foundational software language.
It's excellent.
Which brings up this hilarious, almost absurd point the user made about geographic detachment. Think about the modern demographics of these religions. You have modern Westerners, people sitting in suburban Ohio or London or Berlin, doing absolute backflips to insert themselves as the main characters into these texts.
It's a profound geographical dissonance.
Right, because these texts are strictly, rigidly set in the ancient Middle East and North Africa. Jesus was a first-century Palestinian Jew. These stories have absolutely nothing to do with modern white Westerners.
For a modern Westerner to claim these localized ancient texts as their direct indigenous ancestral inheritance requires ignoring vast swaths of human history.
So mechanics question here. How did that happen? How did a localized Middle Eastern indigenous resistance movement become the dominant white Western religion that feels so natural to someone living in modern America?
Well, it did not happen by accident. It required centuries of deliberate cultural appropriation and systemic rebranding. As the AI maps out the historical timeline, this involved massive artistic reimaging, slowly painting Jesus with fair skin, light hair, and European features over centuries of Renaissance art.
The classic European Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it required a massive political alignment with the Roman Empire. Beginning heavily with Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the indigenous, radical Middle Eastern context of the movement was systematically stripped away.
So it was sanitized.
Sanitized and repackaged, yes. So it could function as the official unified imperial ideology of Rome and subsequently the whole of Europe.
Okay, if we are talking about Rome, we have to talk about the user's most brilliant analogy. If these texts were initially a fractured, localized Middle Eastern movement, how did they get organized into the rigid global operating system we have today?
Enter the Roman Empire.
Enter Rome, and what the user calls the SNL weekend update analogy.
I have to say, from a secular textual criticism perspective, this is a surprisingly accurate framework for understanding the compilation of the Bible.
So the user says reading the modern compiled Bible as a flawless, objective historical news report is exactly like treating a segment of Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update as pure, unfiltered journalism.
Right.
Think about Weekend Update. It references real people, presidents, celebrities, actual events that happened that week. It contains trace amounts of historical truth.
Sure.
But if you were an alien or an archaeologist 2,000 years from now, and you dug up a hard drive with a Weekend Update clip, and you based your entire understanding of reality and your entire legal system on a Colin Jost punchline, people would think you were insane.
Because the function of the segment isn't objective journalism.
Exactly. It's an anthology of performance art, political propaganda, and satirical mythology.
And secular historians treat the ancient texts in exactly this manner. The Bible is not a single book written by a single author. It is a multi-generational anthology spanning centuries. Treating it as a flawless, objective historical textbook is what scholars consider a supreme category error.
A category error. You are demanding a text to perform a function it was never historically designed to perform.
Precisely.
And the reason it feels like a single cohesive book today is because of what Rome did to it. The user points out this massive historical irony that I can't believe I never noticed. Modern society openly acknowledges how brutal, corrupt, and authoritarian the Roman Empire was.
They're the villains of history in most narratives.
Right. I mean, they're the ones who literally nailed Jesus to a cross for being a political dissident. Yet modern believers completely mindlessly accept the final version of the scripture with those exact same Roman authorities compiled, compressed, and approved.
This is the mechanism the AI terms the Roman Empire zip file, an event that crystallized primarily around the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Break that down for us.
We have to look at the mechanics of what was happening. Before Rome initiated this corporate buyout of the religion, early Christianity was not a monolithic, unified entity. It was a highly fractured, decentralized network of radical anti-empire street philosophies.
Really? Like how radical?
Extremely. Some of these sects were entirely plant-based and pacifist. Some were incredibly egalitarian, elevating women to leadership roles. Many were deeply subversive to Roman authority.
They were the original rebels to the system. They were protesting the empire.
Exactly. But an empire cannot govern a fractured, decentralized rebellion. It threatens their tax structures and their centralized power. So Rome stepped in to domesticate the movement.
Wow, domestication.
They used the boardroom meetings at Nicaea, overseen by the emperor himself, to compile a very specific, politically advantageous canon. They essentially burned the radical versions.
What?
They deleted texts they found politically inconvenient or too mystical, things like the Book of Enoch or the Gospel of Mary. And they took the remaining approved documents and zipped the file. They handed humanity a sanitized, locked archive designed explicitly to demand state compliance and hierarchical authority.
And the user summed it up perfectly. They said, you can't claim to be a rebel to the man when you live your entire life by a rule book compiled and zipped by the ultimate system.
It is a profound realization.
It really is. But let me play devil's advocate here. If the file was zipped and locked by the Romans 1,700 years ago, how do modern groups, like the thousands of different denominations today, keep finding new, wildly different, completely contradictory meanings in it? If it's a locked file, shouldn't it mean one thing?
That is the insidious genius of the Roman compilation process. They didn't write a coherent, airtight legal contract. As they stitched these disparate ancient texts together, they inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, curated what the user brilliantly calls a silly putty text.
Yes. The silly putty analogy. For anyone who remembers being a kid and taking a wad of silly putty, you press it down onto the Sunday newspaper comics, and when you pull it up, you've captured the exact image of the cartoon on the putty.
Right.
But then you start to stretch it. You can pull the cartoon character's face so their eyes become massive, or their smile is horribly warped, completely distorting the original image to fit whatever bizarre shape you want to make. The user argues that this is the exact mechanism by which modern churches handle this ancient scripture.
It is the perfect mechanical description of modern applied theology. Because the text is so vast and contradictory, denominations can cherry-pick specific verses, press their modern political or social biases onto the ancient text, and then stretch specific words to make them massive.
While ignoring the rest.
Exactly. They compress or completely ignore the verses that contradict them entirely to fit their current narrative.
And the AI drops the absolute ultimate proof of this silly putty theory. We're talking about the ultimate translation variable that got stretched completely out of proportion over centuries. Number 666.
The literal number of the beast.
Right. If you look at modern fundamentalism, they have stretched this number to represent some cartoon sci-fi supervillain. They say it's the Antichrist, it's microchips and vaccines, it's barcodes on groceries, it's the United Nations. But what does the actual hard archaeology say about this number?
The physical archaeology fundamentally breaks that modern stretching. In 2005, classicists and paleographers analyzed a papyrus document known as Papyrus 1 of 15.
And why is that one so important?
This is a massive deal in biblical archaeology because it is the oldest surviving physical fragment of the Book of Revelation we possess. And when they translated this original Greek fragment, they found that the number of the beast is not 666. It is explicitly written as 616.
Wait, 616.
Yes, 616.
So the scariest number in Western civilization, the number that people literally refuse to have on their license plates, is essentially an ancient typo. How in the world does a mistake like that happen and get logged in for 2 millennia?
It happens because modern readers completely strip away the historical context of the author. John of Patmos, who authored Revelation, was not writing a science fiction prediction of 21st century microchips.
Right.
He was writing a subversive, underground political distress call while living under total imperial lockdown and persecution by the Roman Empire. If he openly wrote, "The emperor is evil and wants to kill us," he would be executed for treason immediately.
So he had to use a code.
Exactly. To avoid execution, he used an ancient cryptographic system called Hebrew gematria.
Okay, break down the mechanics of gematria, because this is the cipher that unlocks the whole thing. How does a number hide a political name?
In ancient Hebrew and Greek, they didn't have separate symbols for numbers like we do today. The letters of the alphabet doubled as numbers.
Oh, I see.
So every letter had a specific numerical value. It functioned perfectly as a code. John was trying to warn his first-century readers about the current, deeply tyrannical Roman emperor, which was Nero.
Okay, so he's trying to spell Nero without writing Nero.
Exactly. If you take the Latin spelling of the emperor's name, which is Nero Caesar, and you translate those letters into Hebrew script, the numerical values of those specific Hebrew letters add up exactly to 616.
Which perfectly matches the oldest surviving papyrus we just talked about.
Precisely. But here is where the translation variable comes in. If you are a scribe copying the text a few decades later, and you decide to use the Greek spelling of his name, Neron Caesar, it adds an extra letter N at the end of Nero.
And what's the value of N?
The numerical value of the Hebrew letter for N, which is none, is exactly 50. Add 50 to 616 and you get 666.
Oh my God. It was just a regional spelling difference.
That's all it was.
It was an ancient political code, literally spelling out the name of a first-century Roman dictator so the early Christians could pass underground messages. And modern churches took that localized historical code, treated it like silly putty, and stretched it across 2,000 years to convince people that the government is trying to put the mark of the beast in their credit cards.
It proves mathematically that when a text is disconnected from its original localized context, it can be manipulated to mean absolutely anything the user desires. It is not a bug in the zipped file. It is a feature of how these texts survive.
Wow. If you're listening to this and feeling a little defensive right now, I completely get it. We're hardwired from birth to view these stories as untouchable, flawless, divine blueprints. But we've just seen the mechanics of how the text was compiled by empires, how it was zipped to enforce compliance, and how it gets stretched by mistranslation.
Right.
So now let's take all of that logic and apply it to the actual theological architecture described within the text, because this is where the user starts finding the massive theological glitches. I want to dive deep into the arsonist firefighter analogy, because this has completely shattered how I view the concept of salvation.
The user deconstructs the traditional dynamic of divine salvation here, and frankly, from a philosophical and logical standpoint, it is a devastating critique of the entire system.
It really is. The user proposes this thought experiment. Imagine this guy shows up in your house in the middle of the night. He actively pours gasoline on your living room floor, lights a match, and sets your house on fire.
Okay.
Then he runs out, stands on your front lawn with a garden hose, puts out the fire, and forcefully demands that you and your children praise him as a heroic, loving firefighter for saving your lives. Now, is that guy a hero? Or is he a psychopath? Because if he's the one who intentionally started the fire, the entire premise of him being a savior is fraudulent.
It's manufactured dependency. And what is truly remarkable is that the AI validates this analogy using the text itself, specifically pointing to the book of Job.
Oh, Job. That story is brutal.
It is. And modern believers often read the story of Job and they project this modern Miltonian idea of Satan onto it. They think of him as this rogue, evil force operating independently against God's will. But that is entirely unbiblical. Yes. In Job chapter 1, the character known as Ha-Satan is not a red guy with a pitchfork ruling over a fiery hell. Ha-Satan is literally a title. It translates to the adversary or the accuser. He functions essentially as a specialized quality assurance beta tester on the divine payroll.
Wait, he's an employee? He works for the architect?
He is a member of the divine council. The text explicitly describes a scenario where God and Satan are casually negotiating a wager in a divine boardroom. God actually initiates the conversation, pointing out Job's loyalty.
Oh, wow.
And they use Job's entire life, his family, his wealth, his physical health, as a destructive testing ground simply to prove a point to each other.
The AI puts this in such stark modern legal terms, and I love it. Under any modern legal framework, if a real estate developer intentionally moves a known arsonist into a neighborhood, places a financial bet with that arsonist on whether a specific house will burn down, allows the house to be destroyed, and then shows up later with a hose to put it out, that is not a rescue operation. That is a federal conspiracy.
It is the definition of racketeering, and the ancient text doesn't even attempt to hide this dynamic. It is openly displaying a system where the omnipotent creator is complicit in, or at least willingly permits, the destruction of a human life specifically to facilitate a test of loyalty and the subsequent necessity of his own salvation.
And think about how the deity responds. When Job, who is sitting in the literal ashes of his ruined life, covered in boils, finally demands some sort of moral accountability from the universe, what happens? Does God show up and say, Job, I am so sorry you got caught in a cosmic beta test, that was my bad?
No, he does not. The AI refers to the ensuing dialogue in Job 38 as the Superman real estate flex.
The Superman real estate flex. I love that.
Instead of providing any form of moral accountability or answering Job's incredibly valid questions about justice, the deity manifests in a whirlwind and spends 4 entire chapters essentially yelling his cosmic corporate resume at Job.
Right.
He repeatedly asks, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fish hook?
It's the ultimate corporate bully move. The user points out that if a construction company built the foundation of your house 30 years ago, that real estate thing gives them absolutely zero legal or moral entitlement in the modern world to show up and burn your house down for fun.
Exactly.
But the text uses absolute omnipotent sovereignty as a massive loophole to completely bypass basic moral accountability. It's like Superman causing a global catastrophe, leveling a city, just so he has an excuse to swoop in, catch a falling car, and ensure the world keeps praising him as the savior.
It highlights a critical structural flaw in the system's architecture. If the creator is truly omnipotent, all-powerful, and truly omnibenevolent, all-loving, the introduction of immense suffering merely to prove loyalty or offer conditional salvation is logically incoherent. The problem of evil remains entirely unresolved by the text.
Which leads us perfectly into how modern everyday humans interact with this incoherent system. The user pivots away from the ancient texts to look at modern believers, and they introduce this concept of the finite prayer token, or viewing the universe as an AI credit system. This analogy completely blew my mind.
It is a brilliant, highly critical application of digital system resource management applied directly to modern spirituality.
Right. So the user says, let's imagine the cosmic architecture of prayer, like a rigid digital AI platform. Let's say there is a finite amount of operational bandwidth, a specific number of tokens distributed to humanity every 24 hours to alter reality.
Okay.
Now picture a comfortable middle-class Westerner entering this cosmic prayer room. They burn one of those incredibly rare tokens to beg the supreme architect of the universe to give them a green light because they're running 5 minutes late to work.
Oh, wow.
Or they burn a token praying that they have a good hair day for a social event, or that their favorite sports team covers the point spread.
By treating the operational energy of the universe as a localized, on-demand concierge service, they are fundamentally prioritizing their own trivial Western comfort over stark global reality.
Exactly. And the moral cost of that assumption is staggering. If you believe prayer actually physically alters reality, and you consume those tokens for personal minor conveniences, the user argues you are actively choosing to leave nothing on the table, no bandwidth left, for a human trafficking victim or a starving child on the other side of the world.
It exposes the intense, almost blinding narcissism of modern comfortable prayer. Anthropologists and cognitive psychologists have a term for this exact behavior: hyperactive agency detection.
Hyperactive agency detection, what is that?
It is an evolutionary psychological byproduct where humans project intentionality, agency, and pattern recognition onto completely random events. It was useful for survival in the wilderness, but when scaled up to a global theology, it becomes a localized delusion. The modern believer operates under the immense assumption that the creator of billions of galaxies, black holes, and vast cosmic structures is actively micromanaging their daily commute on the highway, while simultaneously, consciously ignoring systemic global atrocities. It is mathematically, logically, and morally incompatible.
But wait, if we are treating the universe like this AI credit system, where I can spend tokens to get what I want, what happens when a user tries to hack that system? What happens when human greed enters the chat and demands infinite tokens?
That's a dangerous game.
This narcissistic view of the universe leads us right into the physics of greed, and the user tackles the classic genie paradox, the wish for all the money in the world.
It is a fantastic thought experiment that exposes the complete failure of spatial and economic awareness inherent in human greed.
Let's really map out the physics here. If you pray to the ultimate cosmic genie for all the money, and the code of the universe actually grants your wish, what physically happens to reality?
It's chaos.
First, from an economic standpoint, it instantly breaks the global economy. If one single person suddenly holds all the liquid currency on Earth, that currency instantly becomes completely worthless due to hyperinflation and a lack of circulation.
The rest of humanity would just immediately revert to a new barter system. They'd start trading seashells or batteries.
Yeah.
Your giant pile of money means absolutely nothing.
Right. But it gets worse physically. Imagine the literal physical matter of every single dollar, euro, yen, and gold bar manifesting at once in your front yard. It would create a mountain the size of a football field, hundreds of feet high.
Oh, easily.
You don't become rich, you become an immediate open-air target for global warfare. Every military cartel and desperate person on Earth is coming for your front lawn.
The user joked about this concept for a short film where this literal mountain of physical cash just slowly stalks you, ruining your entire life. Greed is literally a failure of basic physics and spatial awareness. When you force the code of the simulation to give a single user a personalized infinite asset pile, it breaks the game. And yet, this is so often exactly how believers interact with the text, demanding infinite personal blessings, wealth, and victory from an entity whose own recorded behavior, according to the text itself, is wildly unstable.
And that brings us to the cognitive whiplash the user noticed when reading the text. They call it the bipolar altar check. If we actually examine the recorded nature of the deity being prayed to in these ancient texts, the contradictions are terrifying.
The textual contradiction is stark and unavoidable. The text frequently describes the deity as an all-loving, omniscient force of infinite light, grace, and perfect justice.
Right.
But then, almost in the same breath, it instantly pivots to portraying a jealous, raging, deeply insecure entity. For instance, the entity that massacres the firstborn children of an entire nation in a single night in Egypt, just to prove a point to a pharaoh whose heart the deity himself explicitly hardened.
If a human being, like if your neighbor, exhibited those exact same frantic, bloodthirsty, manic mood swings, we wouldn't build an altar for them in our living room. We would call the authorities and have them put in a psych ward.
Oh, completely.
We would deem them a profound danger to society.
And this is precisely where the historical sociological lens provides total clarity. The AI verifies that this textual contradiction is a classic documented example of primitive psychological projection.
Projection again?
Always. Early empires and tribal societies projected the volatile, unstable, violent personalities of their earthly kings onto the cosmos. They created a deity that perfectly mirrored their own warlords, specifically to terrify feral, uneducated populations into absolute state submission.
So the terror is intentional.
The psychological terror is not a side effect. The terror is the point of the software.
Okay, so if the theological mechanics are glitchy, and the deity's personality is basically just a projection of ancient unstable kings, what about the foundational stories, the literal bedrock myths that these entire religious systems are built on?
Right, the origin stories.
Let's take our glasses of cynicism and fact-check Genesis. Let's start with the absolute beginning, the Garden of Eden and the forbidden fruit. Humanity assigns immense cosmic weight to this one event. We blame this fruit for the fall of man. We blame it for the pain of childbirth. We even physically point to the lump of cartilage in a man's throat and call it an Adam's apple.
We do.
But the user points out a massive linguistic accident here.
It is arguably one of the most consequential, cascading translation errors in the history of Western literature. The user correctly notes in their voice memo that we actually have no idea what the forbidden fruit was, and the AI verifies this linguistic claim with 100% accuracy. The original Hebrew text in Genesis simply uses the word peri.
And what does peri mean?
It is a completely generic botanical term. It translates universally to just fruit. It specifies no particular botanical species whatsoever. It could be anything hanging from a branch.
So if the Hebrew just says fruit, like, where did the apple come from? Why is every painting, every children's book, every cultural reference an apple?
Well, it's actually a Latin pun.
A pun.
Yeah, from the 4th century. Let's look at the mechanics of the translation. In the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome was tasked with translating the ancient Hebrew Bible into Latin, creating what is known as the Vulgate.
Okay.
When he reached the concept of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he used the Latin word malus. The linguistic problem is that malus is a homonym. Depending on how it is used, as an adjective, it means evil or bad. But as a noun, it means apple tree.
You have got to be kidding me.
I am not. It was a linguistic pun. It was a clever bit of wordplay by the translator to link the concept of evil with a specific fruit. Early Jewish commentaries never thought the fruit was an apple.
What did they think it was?
The ancient rabbi suggested it might have been a fig because they sewed fig leaves together afterward. Some thought it was a pomegranate, wheat, or even a grape. But because of Jerome's Latin pun, and later because Renaissance painters in Europe needed a familiar localized fruit to paint in their artwork for European audiences, the apple became permanently, stubbornly locked into Western pop culture.
So let me get this straight. An entire foundational doctrine of original sin, thousands of years of deep theological guilt, the imagery we use to define the fall of humanity, is visually represented by a bad Latin pun from the 4th century. That is absolutely staggering. Okay, what about the other massive foundational myth? The flood, the global deluge, Noah's Ark.
Oh, the physical science on this one is definitive.
The user brings this up, and the AI just completely dismantles it from a scientific perspective, right?
Modern geology, archaeology, paleontology, and the global fossil record completely and unequivocally reject the concept of a sudden, global, simultaneous deluge that covered the entire planet, including the peaks of the Himalayas roughly 4,000 years ago. There is zero physical sedimentary evidence for it.
The AI points to unbroken archaeological records to prove this too, right? Like human societies that just kept on living right through the supposed global apocalypse.
Correct. The most prominent example the AI cites is Japan's Jomon culture. We have an uninterrupted, continuous archaeological record of their distinct pottery, their settlements, and their fire pits dating from roughly 14,500 BCE all the way down to 300 BCE.
Wow.
If a global flood wiped out all terrestrial life on Earth roughly 4,000 years ago, that specific cultural and sedimentary timeline would be violently severed. It is not. The Jomon people continued making their pottery completely unaware that the world had supposedly ended.
So if it didn't happen globally, if the physical science absolutely rules it out, where did the story come from? Why is it in the text? The user has this hilarious anthropological theory. They call it the late-for-work inflation.
I love this framing.
Think about human nature. When someone is running late to their job, they don't just walk in and say, I overslept by 10 minutes. They lie. They inflate the story to save face. They say, I hit every single red light. There was a 10-car pileup. A full moon made everyone drive terribly. It was an absolute apocalypse out there.
And ancient people did the exact same psychological inflation with localized weather events. It is a perfect modern analogy for the oral tradition of myth-making. The AI highlights the prevailing scientific consensus regarding the Black Sea deluge theory.
What's that?
Around 7,500 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Strait, catastrophically flooding the localized Black Sea basin. If you were a primitive, early farmer living in that specific valley with no concept of a global map, the massive, violent flooding of your entire known horizon absolutely felt like the entire world was ending.
Right, because that was your whole world.
Exactly. That localized trauma was passed down through the oral tradition for generations, growing larger, more cosmic, and more catastrophic with each telling, eventually birthing the flood mythologies of the ancient Near East.
And Noah isn't even the original version of that inflated story.
No, he is not. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis is essentially a direct, slightly modified cover version of the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a text that predates the writing of Genesis by centuries, and it features an almost identical plot structure.
Like how identical?
Including a deity warning a man about a flood, the building of a large boat sealed with pitch to survive, and specifically sending out a dove and a raven to search for dry land.
It's all borrowed code. It's a zipped file of regional myths, inflated by local trauma and stretched by empires.
Okay, so we've covered the foundational myths of the beginning. We've looked at Genesis. Now we have to move to the ultimate threat at the end of the timeline. The ultimate mechanism of control, hell. The logistics of the afterlife.
This is where the structural mathematics of the theological system completely break down under any serious ethical scrutiny. The user heavily evaluates what they call the VIP passport math of Christian salvation. The logic here is just undeniable. The user outlines the fundamentally broken criteria for this afterlife subscription. Just think about the math of the system. You could have an incredibly peaceful, deeply empathetic Buddhist living in a remote village. They spend their entire 80-year life practicing nonviolence, helping the poor, and reducing suffering. But they happen to live in a geographic region where Christianity isn't the dominant cultural software. Under the strict binary theology of this system, that peaceful Buddhist burns eternally in conscious torment simply for missing the regional subscription window.
The ultimate destination in this framework is conditionalized entirely onto a single binary corporate loyalty variable, accepting a specific savior figure, rather than measuring the aggregate moral data or the actual lived ethics of a human life.
Right. While on the flip side of that same algorithm, you could have a sociopathic mass murderer, a serial killer who caused immeasurable pain and suffering for decades, who hits a deathbed timer. They repent in the last 5 minutes of their life, they accept the correct software terms and conditions, and the system automatically hands them a VIP passport straight to eternal paradise.
It's deeply problematic.
That is not justice. That is a profoundly broken algorithm that incentivizes terrible behavior as long as you hit the reset button before the screen goes black.
The user contrasts this effectively with the traditional Jewish model of the afterlife, specifically the rabbinic concept of Gehenna. In this tradition, Gehenna functions much more like an 11-month purification cycle, heavily based on the recitation of the Kaddish morning prayer. It's a temporary spiritual laundry cycle.
Even that has issues, right?
Yes. Even this model, as the user points out, operates like a deeply flawed municipal justice system, where a teenager who steals a candy bar serves the exact same baseline flat-rate sentence of 11 months as a historic dictator who slaughtered millions.
So both systems, the eternal torture and the 11-month laundry cycle, fail the basic test of proportional justice. But let's dig into the actual translation of the word hell, because the AI drops some serious linguistic history here that completely alters how you read the text.
Oh, the translation history is fascinating.
The modern concept of a fiery subterranean torture cavern run by demons with pitchforks is pure medieval fan fiction. It's a patchwork of 3 entirely distinct ancient words that got smashed together.
Yes, this is a vital linguistic point.
Yeah.
The English word hell has been retroactively and sloppily applied by translators to 3 completely different ancient concepts. First, you have the word Sheol.
Right, Sheol.
This is the primary ancient Hebrew concept found in the Old Testament. It simply translates to the grave or the pit. It was universally viewed as a silent, dark underworld where everyone, both the righteous and the wicked, goes to essentially power down. There is absolutely zero mention of conscious fire, torture, or demons in Sheol.
It's just going to sleep in the dirt. It's the grave.
Yeah, exactly. The second word is a Gehenna. This is where the modern imagery of unquenchable fire actually originates. But Gehenna was not a cosmic spiritual realm. It was a literal, physical, geographical location.
Like a place on a map.
Yes. It refers to the Valley of Hinnom, a ravine located just outside the physical walls of Jerusalem. In the 1st century, this valley was used as a continuously smoking, smoldering municipal garbage dump.
A garbage dump.
They threw refuse and the bodies of criminals there, and fires burned constantly to consume the waste. When Jesus talked about Gehenna in the Gospels, he was using a visceral, local, physical metaphor. He was essentially telling his audience, if you continue down this destructive, rebellious path, you are throwing your life away like the burning city trash outside the walls.
And the Romans, when they zipped the file and translated it for an empire, stretched that highly localized trash metaphor into a cosmic furnace of eternal spiritual suffering. That is wild. What's the third word?
The third word is Tartarus, which appears only once in the New Testament. This word is borrowed directly from ancient Greek mythology. It refers specifically to the deep, subterranean prison abyss where Zeus locked away the rebellious Titans.
So the modern Western view of hell that terrifies so many people today is literally a composite image constructed by translators. It combines the silence of the ancient Hebrew grave, the burning physical trash of a Jerusalem ravine, and the mythological prison of a Greek god.
It is stunning when you look at it clearly.
It is when you step back and see all the seams, when you see exactly how the file was zipped, how it was mistranslated, how local metaphors were stretched into global threats. It completely changes how you view the reality you were raised in.
It definitely shifts your paradigm.
Which brings us to our outro and the overarching feeling of realizing all of this. It can be a very isolating feeling. The user summarizes this feeling beautifully by referencing a very obscure ancient Gnostic text. They describe waking up to this reality as being in the Toy Story Matrix.
It is a profound, albeit disorienting, existential realization. When the rigid, dogmatic infrastructure you've built your life around suddenly collapses under the weight of historical scrutiny, you are left with a massive psychological void.
The user compares our current reality to the framework found in the Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John, which was part of the ancient suppressed texts discovered in the Nag Hammadi library in 1945.
Oh, the text that didn't make it into the zip file.
Exactly. In this specific Gnostic framework, the physical creator of our universe, a being called Yaldabaoth, or the Demiurge, is not the ultimate perfect god of light. Instead, he is an accidental, blind, deeply flawed, and inferior software designer who coded our physical universe out of his own isolation, arrogance, and ignorance.
Hence the Toy Story analogy.
Right. The user likens it to the Pixar movie Toy Story. It's like Andy got bored, completely lost his mind, abandoned his bedroom, and just pieced out, leaving all of us trapped inside the room like abandoned toys. We're just looking around the room, staring at each other frantically, wondering, what do we do now? Who is in charge?
That analogy perfectly captures the exact friction of pulling your head out of a closed-loop, pre-programmed system. The AI actually validates the user's adoption of these glasses of cynicism and nihilism.
Yeah.
Yes. When you finally realize that the binary systems of heaven and hell are not cosmic truths, but manufactured control engines designed by ancient empires to manage populations, you enter what the user refers to as the Midgard gray area.
Midgard, borrowing from Norse mythology, the realm of humanity, the messy, complicated middle ground.
Exactly. Unlike the black and white transactional traps of the Abrahamic subscription options, where everything is either eternal bliss or eternal torture, the concept of Midgard seamlessly aligns with an objective, historically grounded lens. It explicitly accounts for the gray reality of human existence.
Because life isn't binary.
Right. It accepts that we live in an inherently broken, compromised infrastructure where perfect justice cannot be neatly engineered by a single ancient book or forced by the sword of an empire. Paradoxically, fully embracing this messy, uncertain reality actually frees you from the hard-coded ancestral guilt artificially imposed by those old man-made architectures.
And that is the vital, central reminder for you listening right now.
Yeah.
If you're feeling overwhelmed by all this data, remember this entire deep dive wasn't about destroying the concept of belief or proving that personal spirituality is invalid.
Not at all.
It is about understanding the very human corruption, the calculated administrative utility that is woven so deeply into these ancient conglomerate religious packages. Is about recognizing the translation errors, the boardroom buyouts at Nicaea, the bad Latin puns, and the geopolitical whataboutism.
Ultimately, it is about reclaiming your cognitive autonomy from ancient texts that were intentionally zipped and locked by political systems specifically designed to demand your absolute compliance.
So what does this all mean for us tomorrow morning? We've spent this hour seeing exactly how humanity uses linguistic accidents, zipped files, homonyms, and mythological cover versions to build colossal, unyielding systems of control. We throw stones from our glass houses, entirely oblivious to the fragile, stretched, silly putty keeping our own walls intact.
We really did.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. Consider this. If our ancient ancestors, working with scrolls, oral traditions, and limited technology, were capable of collaboratively engineering these massive, generation-spanning virtual realities, coding entirely fictional heavens and hells just to keep a feral population cooperating, paying taxes, and terrified of the dark, what unseen, totally fictional architectures are we actively coding into existence today, fully believing them to be the absolute, unquestionable truth?